All right. People are still jumping in, but we'll get started. Again, nothing too big to announce. Again, everything's kind of same as it always is. What we'll do is have our sort of next quiz 5 will be on Wednesday, right? So just make sure that over the weekend that you're going through, reading the modules, taking notes, doing all the stuff that you've been doing up to this point, to make sure that you're getting ready for that. Again, try and get an early start. Spreading out the prep for these is always going to be better than trying to cram it in on the end. So weather's gross outside, it's snowing. So if you're inside and quarantined anyway, celebrate it with some psychology reading. Samantha will have SI session on Monday. We'll have our review session on Tuesday like we normally do. And then the quiz will be Wednesday. Okay. Questions on any of the material that we've covered up to this point, where we're going with stuff. Okay. A lot of questions, people. It sounds like folks are doing a nice job with getting their research out of the way. That's awesome. If you have any specific questions about when people are going to post credits or anything like that, always good to just get in touch with whoever is listed as the contact person for that study. Sometimes it takes people a little bit to go through it and post those credits. So if you have any questions about that, just go through, get in contact with the person. And if you run into any problems, feel free to shoot me an email, something like that. Okay. All right. Let's finish up then with influences on intellectual ability. Okay. So we talked about some systematic differences with respect to men and women on specific domains of performance on some of these IQ tests. Overall, men and women perform about the same, functionally equivalent on these evaluations. But what happens is when we're looking at certain subdomains, we start to see differences here. So I went through and talked about kind of some hypotheses for what we think may be going on, but again, not a whole lot of consensus on why we're seeing some of these differences in subdomains. At least some evidence, at least from the stuff that we do have, suggesting that it may be sociocultural types of things, and that we start to see these differences disappear in more gender equal societies. Again, and a lot of this research is coming out of Scandinavian countries and things. Okay. We also see differences with respect to race and ethnicity, okay? And this is super, super, super controversial work. But what we see in terms of overall performance on these evaluations, we see in our country, we see that Black Americans are scoring lower as compared to white non-Hispanics. We see white Hispanic Americans scoring between Black and white non-Hispanic groups. And then we see Asian Americans consistently scoring higher than all other individuals from different racial and ethnic groups. Okay. And so, again, this is something that we see fairly consistently, right? And so we can't ignore it. It looks like it's something that's real. But then again, the question is always, why are we seeing these why are we seeing these differences? Okay. And one of the big questions is are our tests biased? Are our tests biased in that they're preferring individuals from some backgrounds relative to others? Okay, and this is a tricky, hot button topic, but from a psychometric research standpoint, it looks like our tests aren't technically biased. Right now, if we had these IQ achievement tests that were predicting things differentially for one group versus another, right? Then that would suggest to us that we had a bias test. So, for example, if I found that IQ predicted GPA or education quite well for white non-Hispanic Americans, but didn't predict educational outcome at all in Asian Americans, that would be some evidence of bias, right? So we've got this test that it's predicting things differently for different groups. And that's not really what we're seeing, okay? And so in terms of the predictive ability of these tests, it looks like there's not technical bias going on there. But what we do see is that some of these items do carry heavy cultural loadings on them, okay? For example, if I go through, and the idea is that if I have little exposure to certain ideas or concepts, right, particularly on some of these subscales, I'm less likely to answer correctly than someone who's sort of immersed in sort of kind of traditional white U.S. culture, okay? So, for example, if general vocabulary types of things, okay? If I go to good schools and I have access to higher levels of education that often aren't available in some impoverished communities, my command of vocabulary, my exposure to different vocabulary words and things along those lines are going to be systematically higher, meaning that I'm going to score better on those subtests relative to someone whose overall intellectual capacity is equal or maybe better than mine. They just haven't had access to good education. So we've got issues going on there. We've also got things that are culturally loaded, right? If I say a question is, what would you do if an older child who's smaller than you tried to pick a fight? Okay. Well, I don't know. Depending on where I grow up, I might punch that kid in the head, because that's just how we handle folks, right? Now, that's not the right question. Punching the kid in the head is not going to get you a correct score on that item, right? But depending on where I'm coming from and my background, that might be how you deal with that situation, right? Other things, so why is it important to pay taxes, right? Now, if I'm sort of come from a background where sort of I talking with my family and they say, oh, these are what taxes are going, sort of things along those lines. But if I don't have that information, I'm not going to score well on these basic information questions, not because I'm not smart. It's just because I haven't had exposure to these types of things, okay? And so because of what's happened is people will criticize some of these evaluations because of the cultural loadings of some of the, particularly the vocabulary and crystallized intelligence information types of questions. And so there are arguments that some of the nonverbal measures are going to be a better predictor or better proxy for overall intellectual capacity than some other things, okay? There's a lot of things in these evaluations that involve just sort of natural processing speed, something that doesn't depend on information that I've acquired and learned. And these are highly correlated with overall intellectual capacity. So even if I don't have access to good education or grew up in an impoverished background, sort of my ability to go through and process information, retain information, manipulate information in shapes and space and things like that could be quite high, even though I haven't had access to sort of other types of things. Okay. And so, controversy about sort of which in the specific components of intelligence are maybe the best indicators of overall ability. But the other thing that's important to recognize is that, these group-based differences, we do see systematic differences, across, different groups. But that doesn't provides us very limited information about any one individual's performance within that group, right? And so while we do recognize that we do see differences across in sort of some of this stuff, it would be incorrect to go through and assume that, because this person comes from Asian American background, that they're necessarily going to perform higher than someone with Hispanic background or Latina background, or that sort of any individual person from white America is going to score better than any specific individual from Black America, right? So we're seeing sort of these large-scale differences, but again, sort of why they're occurring and sort of whether or not they represent sort of bias or a function of the test starts to become really, really hot-button topic, okay? And so again, the question is, is where does this stuff come from? And again, we don't know, right? But the important thing to remember is that just because we're seeing differences, this is not evidence, clear evidence of biological, genetic sort of driven types of things, okay? And again, one of the things that when we go through and look closely at this research, we start to find things that suggest that some of these differences may be more of a cultural access type of thing, as opposed to sort of straight bio, sort of genetic types of things, right? So, for example, we see that the average IQ of individuals in the 1930s relative to today are much greater. That's a greater difference than the current sort of black-white discrepancy, right? If we're looking at people's education levels in the 1930s and sort of just general overall poverty levels relative to today, there's a huge difference, right? And that's bigger than some of the differences that we're seeing. I think this is really compelling. Countries with a large SES discrepancy are showing similar differences across majority and minority groups. So if I, say, go to India, where we might have majority groups and minority groups sort of at the same level, or SES discrepancy as groups that we see here in the U.S., we're seeing the same types of differences in those countries, even though we're talking about completely different groups of individuals. Again, sort of leading into this idea of access. We see again, Asian Americans excelling, but reporting strong cultural pressure for academic excellence, right? This is just something, and again, not everybody, but in general, within Asian American cultures, a strong focus on education and lots of pressure to do well, right? We see that our black-white differences are maximized in high school, but as soon as we get into college, those shrink down. Okay. We also see things stereotype threat. This is sort of being aware of certain stereotypes and then having that sort of being a self-fulfilling prophecy for performance, right? So again, if I had, and there's been research looking at this, so if I had, so the stereotype is that, and so this is a problem for women in STEM, right? Girls aren't, or women aren't good at math. Right. Well, if I go in and I bring in a bunch of women undergraduates and I randomize them to two different groups and I say, all right, ladies, here I'm going to give you this math test, but women generally perform worse than men on this, and then have you go through and take it, and then have another group and just say, all right, here's a math test, go ahead and take it. What we see is some evidence that if I prime you with that stereotype, as on average, you'll perform less or less well than if I didn't prime that. And again, it's this idea of stereotype threat. We know, and we're going to talk about this, we're all aware of stereotypes, even if we don't endorse them, but this can still start to subtly impact performance and things along those lines. So for these reasons, again, the evidence that we do have suggests that some of the differences that we're seeing across groups is likely due to sociocultural sort of types of issues. But again, a lot of work done in this, a lot of controversy with sort of trying to identify mechanisms for some of these discrepancies. Okay. Now, into this. So we always end up with sort of this section. It feels like, okay, sort of IQ end all be all sort of type of stuff for this. But again, and we had a little bit of a discussion. I think Jonathan brought this up a little bit at the end of last lecture about ceiling effects, and it sort of came into play in this. But unless we're talking about sort of the far ends of the spectrum, just natural intellectual ability probably not going to cap opportunities for achievement and success. Okay. Now, if you're an average person, like most of us are, by definition, right? Am I probably going to be sort of crack genetic codes and sort of do stuff like that, or be a sort of genius in something? Probably not, right? But for the most of the stuff that we all do day-to-day function, so it's all going to be sort of things that are achievable within the bounds of sort of normal range of intellectual disability, right? Or normal range of intellectual ability. We see that, so for example, IQ and education correlated about 0.5, IQ and employment about 0.4, IQ and income about 0.2. Okay, so these are clear associations, but they're not one-to-one. So again, if I'm lucky enough to just have sort of higher level IQ, my intellectual ability sort of runs on the higher end, things are just going to be easier for me, probably in terms of sort of at least academic types of things, and that's great. If I'm sort of average or a little bit lower, it might take a little bit more effort, but that's fine too. It's not that's something that's not achievable. I think sometimes people get hyper-focused on IQ as a predictor of social economic status, and boy, if I'm going to be a genius, I'm a genius, and I'm going to go off and sort of make billions of dollars. But actually, when we look at the research, IQ isn't much a better predictor of SES, or IQ is not a much better predictor of your eventual socioeconomic success above and beyond parent SES or your grades. Okay, so again, intelligence is important, interesting concept. Definitely makes sort of helps with our capacity and things, but definitely not the end all be all for sort of what you can achieve in terms of sort of goals, outcomes, things like that. Okay. All right. Questions on any of this? So make sure to go through, take a look at the lecture summary. Make sure to go through, take a look at comprehension check. But any questions on sort of this material here? Feeling all right with this? Okay, cool. All right, well, let's switch over to then personality. Okay. And what we're going to cover today in terms of personality, talking some historical perspectives on personality, sort of involving Freud, humanists type of thing. And personality, sort of grouping personality with sort of intelligence stuff and thinking, decision making. It's not it's kind of an interesting combination. But if we're thinking about sort of characteristic features of people, just like sort of general traits with a lot of variability in the population that have a strong genetic component to them, personality kind of fits within this. Okay, so again, we're going to go through today, talk about Freud. Freud had one of the first and most comprehensive models of personality, and it's something that you'll hear about a lot, so I want to go through and cover that. The humanistic perspective on personality isn't so much focused on personality per se, as just sort of recognition of sort of the factors that contribute to human potential, but thinking about all of this as general approaches to how psychologists have tried to understand the types of patterns and ways people think, feel, behave, and why they act the way they do. Okay. So if we're thinking about personality, okay, think about personality as an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Okay. If I go through the dictionary and start pulling up words and flagging words that can be used as personality descriptors, there's going to be lots and lots and lots of stuff in here, right? We've got who do we have here? It looks like we have Katie, all right, and we have a word cloud for Katie here. I don't know. I stole this off the internet, so thanks to Katie somewhere, wherever she is today. Okay, but this idea of how we go through and describe people, right? And so if I ask any of you, oh, hey, sort of describe your friend's personality or your sort of family's or your brother or sister's personality or your partner's personality, you're going to be able to do that easy, right? You're like, oh, they're this way, they're this way, they're this way, right? So we all understand what personality is sort of at the 10,000 foot level, but what we're interested in psychological science is what what makes this up? What drives some people to be one way or another way? And this is where we start to get into some classic theories. And again, Freud was one of the first individuals to come through and put together a systematic model of personality, right? To kind of go through and say, all right, I'm calling my shot. Like, this is how I think personality sort of develops and how it works. Okay. Now, think about Freud, right? We touched on Freud a little bit before. Just a little bit of background on Freud. Freud, oldest child, had a father that was pretty authoritarian, right? Father, pretty rule-driven stuff. Freud had a close relationship with his mother. Family, not from a lot of means, right? They weren't a rich family, but were so supportive of Freud going through and getting an education. Freud got his, was a medical physician, got his degree in Vienna, and then had a private practice in clinical neurology. Now, again, this was kind of before psychology was a big thing. We didn't have psychologists. So he was a clinical neurologist, right? And thinking about, this, anybody know anything about Victorian Europe? Sort of mid to late 19th century Europe. What was going on? What was the culture like there at that time?
It was very rule-driven, and your role in society was very much determined by your social status, socioeconomic status. That basically dictated who you talked to, how you behaved, what you wore, and everything about your life.
Hannah, that is fantastic. How do you know so much about Victorian Europe?
I'm a history nerd and always have been.
Okay. That's fantastic. And you're absolutely right. At this time, right? Like, you had kind of your station in life. Things were pretty set up, right? And there are very, very strict rules around how we conduct ourselves in society, and sort of where you could do, what you could go. Question, sort of not to sort of embarrass you, but what were at this time? What were the views on sexuality in terms of how people dressed and sort of what was polite conversation, things like that?
So, especially if you look at clothing, and something random interesting fact is they would put skirts around chairs because the legs on chairs were considered too sexual.
Yeah.
So they would put skirts. It was basically, you didn't talk about it ever.
Exactly. Okay. So for those of you who aren't history buffs, Hannah, thank you. That is fantastic, because you're exactly right. Right. At this time, if you're thinking about sort of what people were dressing in sort of England and sort of other areas in Europe here, this is the time. High collars, right? Collars right all the way up to your chin, right? Sleeves down to the wrist, long skirts, right? Because as Hannah said, one, we've got very, very strict rules on what's appropriate behavior, what you can or can't do, and anything that could be potentially construed as sexual in nature was very, very taboo. It wasn't a part of things we could talk about in polite society, okay? Now, people were having sex. People were, for sure, sort of going out. People were going to brothels. People had mystery. There's a whole lot of stuff going on, but no one talked about it because you couldn't even say, look at the legs of chairs, right? Or anything that was sort of consistent or sort of would be talking about. This is a sort of, in literature, you've got people writing sort of very erotic poetry about flowers, right? It's all sort of very veiled types of stuff, right? But you just can't, it wasn't a time when you could come out and talk about things, right? And so this was the time that Freud grew up in, and you start to see sort of what was going on around him starting to influence how he was thinking about human behavior, the nature of people, so on and so forth, okay? And so Freud's view of human behavior is that, again, and we talked about this, the behavior is deterministic, driven by unconscious motivations and instinctual drives, okay? Remember that Freud's perspective is it's all this sort of seething cauldron of sort of unconscious desires that's determining what I'm doing, okay? And you think that you're here today sort of attending this lecture because you chose to, and that because you wanted to make sure that you're sort of getting this information. Freud would say, in fact, that's not the case. Your perception of free will is all driven by your sort of unconscious instincts and desires and things along those lines. And Freud proposed two different basic sort of drives: the life instinct and the death instinct. Okay. Now, the life instinct started out as sort of libido sexual drive, right? Sort of this desire to sort of procreate and sort of go through. Freud identified this as sort of the main positive driver was sexual drive. And so he got criticized because he was like preoccupation with sex. But again, if you understand, in Victorian Europe, where he was sort of raised in the time going, like no one could talk about it, right? Didn't mean that no one wasn't thinking about it. It so did this kind of suppressed thing. And so Freud eventually expanded this out to sort of refer to it life instincts more general, but hypothesized this unconscious life instinct driven by sort of to assure survival, to grow, to develop, and this life instinct offset by the death instinct. This, in Freud's model, is your unconscious aggressive desire to hurt yourself, hurt other people, to just go through and destroy. Okay? And so Freud's view of human nature is that we're motivated by these competing life instincts and death instincts. I want to grow, I want to grow, I want to grow, versus I want to destroy other people, myself, self-sabotage, this type of thing. Okay? And so when you think about sort of in classic sort of cartoons, things, angel and devil sort of on different shoulders here. This is kind of pulling from a lot of how Freud viewed things. Okay. Questions about sort of Freud's view of human nature. All right. So this is sort of how Freud viewed, like, sort of how are people sort of just in their natural state. But then what he based on sort of his work with individuals coming in for treatment, developed a fairly intricate model of personality. Okay. And Freud said personality is based on three different components. The first is your id. Okay. Your id is your primary source of energy. This is your instinct. And Freud hypothesized or proposed that this id is directed by pleasure principle. Okay. Your desire to seek pleasure, avoid pain. Right? This pleasure principle says that your id is driven to do everything that feels good right now in this moment. If it feels good right now, your id wants it. And if it is inconvenient or boring or is painful or hard, id wants nothing to do with it. Right? Freud proposed id as immoral, illogical, largely unconscious. Right? And you can think about if we were driven completely by id. You think about id, like if you've got, like id is just a sort of a wild person just out there doing, like, right now, anything that I want to do that feels good, I'm going to do it. Who cares what the consequences are for other people, for myself? It doesn't matter if this is a good thing or an accepted thing. I just want to do what I want to do. Okay. Now you can imagine if this is where we're all, and sort of Freud says, like, this is at our core. It is where we're at, right? But society can't function on it, right? And so what Freud proposed is that our id is offset on the other end of the spectrum by superego, okay? Superego is your moral, idealistic self, okay? It's your system for sort of driven by society, traditional values, morals. Your superego strives for perfection and being perfect in the eyes of society and sort of whatever societal bounds are. Okay. And so you say, okay, this is good, right? Yeah, we should all sort of try to be good and sort of achieve sort of high values and morals and things like that, right? Fair enough. But what happens if I have too much of this? What happens if I'm going too far the opposite way and completely sort of living my life and determined by sort of societal ideals for perfection and things along those lines? How do I feel? Any thoughts? Yeah. So what if I sort of my complete life and sort of my complete existence is trying to live up to sort of not just sort of kind of holding this the ideals of society, but sort of the very top. And anything less than perfect is a failure. How would that make me feel?
Feel kind of bad.
Yeah, I would feel kind of bad and kind of anxious, right? And so on the inside of things, we've got someone who's a maniac, right? So they're just going out and doing sort of whatever feels good. On the other hand, you've got superego. This is where all the high collars, all the rules of society, if I sort of make even one mistake, it means that I've ruined everything, that I've sort of like I'm not a good person, sort of type of thing. It's not realistic. And then I'm going to feel anxious and bad about myself, right? And so what Freud proposed was in between these two is the ego, okay? Your ego is your executive system that's governing sort of your personality, right? If you've got good, strong, if the ego is strong, ego is trying to navigate the relationship between the id and the superego, okay? Ego is the one who's saying, okay, id, I can't just go out and be drunk and take drugs and have sex and beat people up and take what I want all the time. That's going to get you thrown in jail. Superego, we can't be perfect all the time and always be worried about what other people are going to think about us and sort of always achieve this high level of perfection because we're going to be miserable, and that's not a realistic thing. So somewhere in the middle needs to be sort of where we're going to get this balance, okay? And so, again, the ego in Freud's model is directed by this reality principle. This is how we go through and satisfy my needs, all right? We need some element of both of these, but really I'm the one who's going to be in charge of this. I'm the adult in the room as ego, and I'm going to go through and sort of moderate this, okay? But what Freud proposed here is that these components of personality are driven sort of on a hydraulic system, okay? I only have so much psychic energy, right? I only have so much sort of power to direct two different things, right? And in the best case scenario, if I'm a well-adjusted person in Freud's model, ego gets most of the power, right? But as we start to sort of give more power to one side, the other stuff starts to come down, right? If any of you are sort of mechanically inclined, right? That's how a hydraulic system works, right? I've got two cylinders, right? If I pump fluid into one, the one goes up, what happens to the other one? It goes down, right? Go put fluid in the other one, it goes up, the other one goes. There's only so much to go around, right? And so in Freud's model, if it is getting too much of my psychic energy, what happens to my ego and my superego? Sort of drops down. We're starting to see things like what Freud sort of would identify as sort of manic types of symptoms. People going out, sort of self-sabotaging and just sort of going nuts because things feel good to me right now. If my superego gets too much, then I'm probably going to be super strict, super anxious, super high-strung and worried about sort of societal stuff. And so what we need in this is a balance, okay? People see kind of how id, superego, ego are working and how Freud sort of proposed these to interact. Okay, cool. So, other thing that was a big component of Freud's model of personality is this idea of unconscious, right, and levels of consciousness. Freud proposed that the majority of our sort of memory, that our sort of experience, that sort of our sort of who we are, the majority of it is down in our unconscious. Your unconscious is sort of takes all your experiences, repressed material. I can't see your unconscious. This is often diagrammed as like an iceberg, right? If I see, oh boy, just the tip of an iceberg poking above the water, is that all I need to worry about? Nope, there's a giant chunk of ice under there that I can't see, right? And so Freud proposed that this unconscious mind is not accessible to us. If I say, hey, Jacob, tell me about what's going on in your unconscious, like you can't, because it's not accessible, right? But what Freud proposed was that what we could do is we could start to get insight into what's going on in the unconscious of individuals through things like dreams, right? tell me about your dreams. And based on your dreams, I'll tell you or start to sort of make guesses about what's going on in your unconscious. Slips of the tongue. Freud felt that if I sort of like, oh, whoops, I messed up a word, Freud would say, nope, that's not just a random mistake. That's your unconscious trying to poke through. Okay. Hypnotic suggestion. If I go through Brooke and I hypnotize you, okay, and sort of have you go through and sort of observe your behaviors under hypnosis, that's giving me sort of an insight into your unconscious. Projective tests, right? I show you a picture, an ink blot, and you tell me what you see. That's your unconscious coming through, telling me what's happening. And then sort of if I sort of have a psychotic break and I'm sort of having hallucinations and delusions, sort of the content of that sort of speaking to unconscious. Okay. So again, in Freud's model, down here, sort of this unconscious energy that's not accessible, this is where your id and all your repressed memories and stuff like that live. If we go up and we hit your preconscious mind, preconscious is stuff that's going on outside of your awareness. But if I ask you to pull it in and sort of come up and sort of say, hey, tell me about this and that, you can pull that stuff up. And here is kind of where your ego, superego hang out. And then at the top here is your conscious mind. That's the stuff that's going on right now that's in your awareness, at least in Freud's model. Okay. All right. So this is kind of, again, it gets into a lot more depth, and a lot of it's kind of there's a lot of weird stuff in there, right? But this kind of gives you an overview of Freud's original model of personality. And again, one of the most comprehensive and influential theories that we've had in the history of psychology. There's still people today who draw on this theory as a way to try and explain sort of human behavior, personality, and things like that. Okay, so hugely influential. Highlights the processes occurring outside of our awareness, right? And this is sort of before, like, oh, what's going on, or sort of who are you as a person? Well, I'll just tell you, why did you behave this way or that way? Oh, well, I did it because of X, Y, or Z. What we know is from continued study and modern study that the things that start to influence our behavior are often things that we're not aware of, right? Now, this idea of this unconscious is probably not how things work out, right? But the idea that we're always consciously aware of all influences on our behavior at all points in times is ridiculous. And so Freud sort of highlighting that things outside of our awareness can influence our behavior. And again, continues to be influential for a large group of clinicians. It's rare to have, there aren't too many straight up Freudian psychoanalysts where you come in, I'm going to sort of just lay on a sort of a couch and free associate for you. That's not how we do things. I mean, if you get into East Coast stuff, there's more people there. We have better treatments for this that actually work sort of according to science, but it still starts to be influential. But the limitations, obviously, questionable scientific methods. Again, Freud's approach wasn't systematic or scientific in any way. It was just based on his notes, kind of his thoughts and feelings about things, based on individuals who were struggling with mental health difficulties, struggling with depression, anxiety, questioning whether or not that's a representative sample to structure a model of personality. Huge inordinate focus on sexuality and sexual impulses. This is not to say that sexual motivations don't influence behaviors, because they very much do, but not everything always has to come down to sex all the time. And so Freud has been criticized for putting too much emphasis on this. And then from a scientific standpoint, probably the biggest criticism here is that Freud's model has very little predictive value. Okay, if I understand sort of, let's say, Madison, I'll just use you because you're sort of sitting here in my line of sight. If Madison comes in and tells me about sort of, say, like difficulties or struggles or things like that, and then I hear about her life history, her relationship with her family and things like that, I can come up with a very elaborate sort of reasoning for why Madison acts the way she does today, right? And so retrospectively, I can come up with all sorts of interesting explanations. But predicting, right? If Madison were to say, hey, this is sort of how I grew up and things along those lines, and then I had to, without information, predict on sort of Madison, how you relate to other people, how you sort of, your struggles with direct, I can't do that, right? You can have two people with the exact same background have completely different things. Freud's model predicts both of those perfectly if I have full information and know ahead of time. But in the absence, it's hard. It doesn't do a good job in terms of predicting. And again, remember, if we're talking about qualities or characteristics of a good theory, we need to have theories make consistent predictions, and Freud's doesn't. It's good to go backwards and sort of try and talk about things. Oh, hey, this is why. Doesn't do a good job of predicting things forward. All right. Questions about Freud, some of his models, some of the stuff that he's putting together here. All right. Cool. Usually I have people who sort of have lots of thoughts and opinions about Freud, but not in this group. So, okay, we're going to move on to humanists. All right. Humanists. Remember, the humanists, these are the folks who sort of kind of came out of a reaction to psychoanalysis and behaviorism, these very deterministic perspectives on human behavior, to say, hey, what we want to do is focus on what makes people excellent, what helps people achieve their goals, and so on and so forth. Now, again, main sort of folks in this area, Carl Rogers, right? Some background on Rogers, very, very religious family, sort of strict, Puritan type family, discouraged playfulness and affection, lonely childhood. Mom sounds like liked to play judging games, but ended up being a professor of psychology, nominated for Nobel Peace Prize, one of the biggest figures in psychology in the entire world, right? Maslow, another big feature in the humanistic movement, or person in the figure in the humanistic movement, born into an abusive family, labeled as mentally unstable, but once again sort of rose to be one of the most influential sort of psychologists in terms of ideas about hierarchy of needs and things like that, right? And so these folks, even coming from kind of difficult backgrounds, went through and were able to go through and achieve. And so from a humanist standpoint, right, the idea of human nature is that human behavior is determined by free will. It's not unconscious drives. I'm not determined by stimulus response. I get to choose who I am going to be, who I want to be. My free will is first and foremost in explaining my behavior. Again, as a different from Freud, who identified people as at their sort of very basic, is sort of driven by this id, by this pleasure principle. I want things that feel good, and I sort of to hell with everybody else. Humanists, very different perspective, believe that we all, at our very core, are intrinsically benevolent and altruistic. If given the proper circumstances, we will move towards being good, being helpful, being altruistic, and wanting the best for our fellow man. Again, if given the proper conditions. So very, very different perspectives on sort of who we are as human beings at our core. Okay. Now, Rogers and Maslow focused on slightly different sort of things. Okay. Rogers' work and sort of his writings primarily concerned with personal relationships being the vehicle for getting you to being the best person that you are, right? Rogers proposed that individuals will meet their highest potential if they have even one relationship that's marked by genuineness, right? Which means that if Cameron, you come in, I'm your friend, and you're telling me about stuff, I'm sort of genuinely sort of caring about you. I'm not sort of just kind of checked out, and then later I'm going to go talk to Daniel and say, oh, hey, can you let me tell you what Cameron sort of said, right? No, I'm genuine. Like if I'm there with you, I'm there with you, right? I'm exhibiting empathic understanding, right? I don't know. I can never live in your shoes. I can never be exactly in your spot, but what I can do is I can go through and I can try and understand, and I can try and empathize with your situation, and our relationship is going to be marked by unconditional positive regard. This means that no matter what you do, I'm not going to judge you. I might not agree with all the things that you do, but I'm going to try and understand why you did them. I'm not going to judge you, and I'm going to be there's outside of very few things, right? There's not anything that you can do that's going to say, okay, I'm going to write Cameron off because Cameron's a garbage person because, I don't know, or that being friends with Cameron is inconvenient for me, so no thanks, right? And so Rogers believed that if people have relationships that are marked by genuineness, empathic understanding, and unconditional positive regard, that these individuals will grow towards their best potential if given an opportunity to do so. Okay. Rogers his work ends up being sort of the foundation for humanistic therapy, right? This is non-directive therapy, person-centered therapy. Jonathan, if you're coming in and I'm providing humanistic person-centered therapy, I don't have an agenda. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to go through and we're going to talk and we're going to see sort of what types of things are going on. I'm going to be supportive. I'm going to be reflective and empathic, things along those lines. And from Roger's standpoint, this type of humanistic approach, if you don't have this type of relationship in your own life, what I am is I'm there to be your therapist and provide this for you to allow you to grow until you can achieve and then sort of go off and be the best person that you can be. Okay. So this is Rogers. Maslow, a little bit different. Maslow, was the developer of sort of this idea of this hierarchy of needs. Okay. So Maslow was concerned about sort of relationships, but in Maslow's perspective, relationships were just one step in a sort of a long system or a system of things that people needed in order to achieve the best sort of highest level that they can be. Okay. And for Maslow, at the very bottom of this pyramid is we need to have basic physiological needs, right? I need to have food, water. I need to be able to use the bathroom. I need to have, if I don't have air to breathe or food to eat, I am not going to be able to move forward on things, okay? But if I have those basic physiological needs met, then I need safety, then I have safety needs. Do I have resources? Do I have family? Do I have sort of security of my health? Do I have a sort of not having to worry about someone coming out and attacking me or victimizing me, right? And if I don't have these things, then it's hard to move up, right? If you think about individuals who are sort of in sort of situations where they're maybe homeless, right? I have basic concerns with my physiological and safety needs. It's hard for me to sort of achieve and be the best person I can be if I'm constantly worried about where I'm going to sleep, where I'm going to eat, and sort of not getting attacked by somebody, okay? Up, we've got love and belonging needs, right? So once we've got safety and physiological needs, we can start worrying about friendships, family, sexual intimacy, relationships. And then once we've got that, then we can talk about self-esteem, achievements, confidence, respect from others, respect for others. And then if we get those esteem needs taken care of, then we're at the top of the pyramid. This is where Maslow said that people, and only a very small percentage of people, achieve what he referred to as self-actualization. Okay, and self-actualization involves sort of this kind of the peak of the mountain, right? People who have achieved self-actualization, characteristics of a self-actualized person, these are folks who are creative, they're accepting, spontaneous, independent, problem-centered, meaning that they're sort of focused on things outside of themselves, right? Like, what are the world issues? What are the big issues that I can help try and solve and sort of contribute to? Peak experience. If you've ever sort of think about a time where you were doing something and you were just so sort of immersed in that thing that everything else kind of faded away and that you were just there, engaged, and sort of having sort of that high level where nothing else was around, right? This is what Maslow was talking about in terms of peak experience, right? And identifying individuals who've self-actualized as having this as a regular occurrence, having close relationships, democratic character, and general sympathy for humankind, okay? Now, Maslow sort of developed his idea of self-actualization based on, you know, a handful of individuals who we would normally, as sort of as a world, think about exceptional. We're talking about you know, Beethoven, Einstein, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, right? Sort of these folks who are sort of influential, sort of people who, at least in Maslow's idea, had sort of achieved all these sort of lower order needs and have achieved this self-actualization. But Maslow proposed that not all of us achieve this self-actualization, right? Just because these lower order needs are hard to sort of fulfill. But if we do that, then we're able to go through and hit that self-actualization. So still concerned with circumstances and things that are required to be the best person you can be, but sort of a little bit different perspective than Rogers. Okay. So we'll talk about contributions, limitations of the humanistic stuff when we catch up on Monday. But any questions about intelligence, about Freud, about humanists, sort of ideas on personality, and any of that stuff?
Oh yeah, sorry. Can you go over peak experience? How did you define that?
Yeah, peak experience is going to be sort of this experience of just being immersed into something, right? Think about it. So for any musicians out there, good musicians, all right, Daniel, okay, a number of people, right? So thinking about if you're playing, right, and so you just become so, it's just kind of, it's flowing. It's just coming automatically. Like you're not thinking about it. You're just surrounded by sort of this piece that you're playing. Everything else is kind of gone, and it's perfect. Everything is just firing. That would be something that that Maslow might identify as a peak experience. Okay, or let's say if you're on vacation and you're at sort of national park or something like that, and just in this sort of kind of euphoric state where sort of things are sort of beautiful, you're sort of witnessing this thing, and you just, nothing else is coming in your head. You're 100% present and focused on this thing that's happening right now. So these are the types of peak experiences, and Maslow would say they don't last a long time, right? They're not sort of sustained, but the idea for people who have achieved self-actualization, this peak experience is something that comes up sort of more often than those of us who haven't hit there, and sort of sometimes experience it sometimes, and it's beautiful when it happens. But so I've got too many lower order things that that are popping into my head that I'm sort of struggling with. Does that help, Jonathan? Okay, cool. Other questions? Feeling all right with this? Okay, good. Well, let me know. Again, make sure that you're going through reading the modules, taking notes on the modules. If something comes up that's got you confused or turned around, let me know. Otherwise, enjoy a cold weekend with some snow. All right, cool. Great seeing you guys. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll catch you on Monday.